This is Germ Warfare, the battle of ideas.
My name is Germ. This is Germ Warfare, the battle of ideas. Kees van der Pijl, thank you for joining me again in the trenches.
Yeah, my pleasure, Joe.
Are we in a propaganda war?
Yes, but then ever since the wars of the beginning of the 20th century, all wars have mainly been struggles to convince the population to accept that people will be dying for some cause. And for the West, these causes have always been things that for the average person were very doubtful as a cause to die for. So you had to depict the opponent as the incarnation of evil. You had to suggest situations of extreme danger in which thinking itself had to be suspended and everybody had to be ready for sacrifice. And you probably know the great stories about William Randolph Hearst, the guy who set up a newspaper in the United States. I think that Orson Welles made his famous film Citizen Kane on the model of Hearst, and Hearst really, as a newspaperman, almost engineered the war over Cuba. The war with Spain, it was, that got Cuba into the sphere of influence of the United States, and that was a propaganda war. And it's interesting to see, especially now, that few societies have developed the capacity for complete propaganda as the United States have. You know, if you read a book like, and that was what followed on Hearst. If you read a book like Walter Lippmann, 1925, Public Opinion, that's the title of the book. You see that he systematically develops the idea how to manipulate people into following any cause. And there was also the cousin of Freud, Edward Bernays, who was in the public relations field, a pioneer of public relations. And the United States and the West generally have such a sophisticated understanding of how you manipulate people that all other societies, especially, well, today we are in a struggle with between the West and Russia. And one of the first things that you observe is that Russia is helpless in terms of framing its cause. The ability to, well,
sorry, what do you mean?
In the West, we have the term narrative, and in 2014, I'm jumping from one thing to the next, but in 2014, when that was the year of the coup d'état in Ukraine. Maybe we have a chance to talk about that later. And Wesley Clark, the former NATO commander, a one-time presidential candidate, he, in 2014, was an advisor in the field of the new Ukrainian people in power, because everybody was expecting that this would lead to a breakup of Ukraine, real fighting, and so on and so forth. And Wesley Clark at that time said, in an email to the current NATO commander, Breedlove, if Ukraine loses the narrative, Russia will move aggressively forward. So he said there has to be a story in which everything falls in place. And Russia is accused of aggression. You know, the uprising of the people who wanted good relations with Russia in the east and in Crimea, etc., had to be framed as a Russian advance because he said literally, if Ukraine loses control of the narrative, Russia will advance. And that's when I first read that, I thought that's a strange way of looking at things because you and I, as well, maybe you're more sophisticated than I, military man, but you would think that a struggle anywhere is first of all decided by the force of arms.
No.
But in reality, it is decided by the ability to create a frenzy of commitment among large numbers of people. And in that, the West, you might almost say, has won every war so far and will continue winning them as long as the others are able to muster some comparable form of ideological mobilization. You know, the West is so superior and has developed these narratives to such a degree of sophistication that it's very difficult for societies which are not able to do that to enter that part of the arena, however much firepower they may have.
Just for clarity, when you say the West, what do you mean?
Well, in my worldview, the West was the moment when the British Isles turned westward. So when Britain conquered, when England conquered Scotland and Ireland and crossed the Atlantic and set up colonies in North America, and that created the Atlantic basin in which capitalism came of age, and then later, of course, for the convicts, there was Australia, New Zealand, and that the English-speaking core of the West is really
And South Africa too.
anchor point. Yeah.
And
Well,
South Africa.
of course, was a crucial link as late as 1900, which is why Britain fought this for the time very important war with the Boers.
So you were jumping a little bit ahead of me. I just want to go back a few steps just so that we can create a context here. It's very easy to get caught up in the details, but would you mind just giving me an overview of how this Ukrainian-Russian relationship began?
Well, we can go back very far, and I can just say that what you always hear is that we're talking about brother people, you know, fraternal peoples, and so on. And of course, Kiev was the original center of Christian Russian civilization, and only later that moved to the north. But in the west of current Ukraine, there has always existed a sort of mini civilization which has struggled to survive amidst the rivalries between Russia on the one hand, the Asian hordes, so to speak, so the Tatars and all these people who were coming in from Central Asia along the steppe, and then you had the Polish-Lithuanian Empire also pressing on Ukraine, the original Ukraine, which was largely a very fertile agricultural area with its own dialect, language. And a peculiarity of that area is also that in the 9th to 12th centuries AD, the Tatar ruler of the area that is now Ukraine and southern Russia decided that he wanted to move from his own primitive religion to monotheism. and he and his advisors looked around. Well, we're pretty far back now, but it's important to understand the complexity of that society. And he saw on the one hand a flourishing Baghdad. That would mean that if he adopted the Muslim religion, he would be a subordinate of Baghdad. If on the other hand he adopted Christianity, he would be a subordinate of Byzantium. So he looked at the one other religion, and that was Judaism, and that explains why. Rather than Jews in southern Russia and Ukraine being dispersed people who once lived in Palestine, that explains why there are so many Jews in southern Russia and Ukraine. So you have the original Ukrainians resisting, on the one hand, Poles, and they have committed incredible massacres of Poles. On the other hand, they have resisted Russia, and furthermore, they have been anti-Semites of a very, of the first order. And in the course of their history, they actually never had a state of their own, apart from that resistance in all these directions. So in a way, it's a hopeless cause that they're fighting. Yet they were the most important nationality, apart from the Poles and the Finns, who were, of course, relinquished from their membership of the Russian Empire by the revolution. The Ukrainians remained within revolutionary Russia after a short period in which they were a German dependency after the First World War and the Russian Revolution. But some of the most interesting writings of Lenin on national self-determination are about the Ukrainians. And that means that even far-sighted and revolutionary visionaries realized that there would always be a problem of having Ukraine with this complex history inside a Russian-dominated formation. And Britain's advice was, let these Ukrainians go, let them form their own state, and let the progressive forces then become dominant, so that they want to return to this larger brotherhood of progressive formations, and so on and so forth. That is the broad. Well, I would have failed my exam already now on many points if this was an exam, but this gives you a rough idea of the issues that are at stake when we talk about the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. In 1922, when the Soviet Union was formed, a large part of southern Russia was added to the original Ukraine. Roughly the river Dnieper, the river, a very broad river on which Kiev is located.
It's sort of in the middle.
Yeah, exactly. It cuts right in the middle of Ukraine, and everything to the right of that was formerly Russia. And that was 1922. And I once asked somebody who really knows things about this prehistory, and he said to me that probably the reason was that the Bolsheviks in power were concerned about the role of the Cossacks, and that they wanted to have a large area in which several nationalities were represented, and the entire Cossack population was represented as well. But I can't judge that because I have no independent knowledge. And in 1954, Khrushchev, as they said, in a drunken mood, gave away Crimea also to Soviet Ukraine. Although Crimea was a favorite destination for Russians who were about to retire and wanted to enjoy the warm climate. It's a Riviera on the Black Sea.
So it was mostly Russian.
Crimea. Oh yeah, yeah, and a remnant, of course, of the Tatars, because Crimea was the last part of the Tatar Empire that once existed, which was actually inhabited by Tatar in spite of the forced um, removal of the Tatars by Stalin, because the communist leadership was very suspicious of the Ukrainians all along, and there were always, well, for instance, one of the reasons why the Soviet leadership decided to intervene in Czechoslovakia in 1968, when there was a modernization movement, very heterogeneous, was because the leader of Ukraine in the who was represented, of course, in the Politburo in Moscow, said if we allow Czechoslovakia to go its own way, Ukraine might also want to do that, and we can't.
Oh.
We can't run that risk. So one of the reasons why there was a narrow majority in the Politburo in Moscow to clamp down on the modernization policy in Czechoslovakia was again the potential unreliability of Ukraine. And of course, the most dramatic form of that unreliability had been the fact that in Western Ukraine, so west of the river Dnieper, there were many people welcoming the Nazis when they invaded in June 1941. So I wasn't even chronological, but you probably see we have an area here which is charged with identity politics.
It's completely different.
Yeah.
The two sides are very different.
Yeah, and the Eastern, what the people who are heroes for the Western part are villains for the Eastern part, and vice versa. Like, for instance, the leadership in the Second World War of the Ukrainian West, who collaborated with the Nazis and committed, as I said, unspeakable crimes against Jews, against Poles, and against communist Russians.
This was inside Ukraine.
Yeah.
So why is Crimea still so important?
Well, it is like a solid aircraft carrier commanding the whole Black Sea. So there's no way that Sebastopol, which is the location of the Black Sea Fleet of Russia, Sebastopol has a very heroic history of its own. You know, the Nazis, of course, wanted to conquer it. There was a fight, I forget the length, I think almost a year, to get hold of Sebastopol. It had to do also with the birthday of Hitler, etc. The Germans had their best commander, Manstein, leading the attack, and even he didn't succeed in conquering it. So now, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Black Sea Fleet was still in Sebastopol. Of course, it was now part of Ukraine. So they concluded for several decades, a lasting agreement, a lease, in which, in exchange for cheap gas, Russia could use the facilities of the naval base of Sebastopol.
So then, and Crimea is obviously still important, as we know, and we'll get to that in a moment. But also the east of Ukraine.
They're both the Donbass. It means the basin of the River Don, and it's Luhansk and Donetsk.
That's right, Luhansk. There we go.
These are the provinces, but other areas like the province of Kharkov and Odessa, for instance, on the Black Sea coast, they are also Russian dominated. So they have a long history of association with with Russia. And don't forget that the whole eastern, so the Russian part, was the center of the industrialization drive in the late 1920s and 1930s. So whereas Western Ukraine is primarily agricultural, although there are also important factories in Lviv or Lvov or Lemberg, as it was called when it was still Austria. The heavy industries are typical of the East. So you have Zaporozhye, Kharkov, with its tank factories, etc. This is a mining area, steel factory area, that was extremely important in the Soviet era. So Khrushchev, for instance, was an Ukrainian. He made his career in Ukraine, but other later leaders also had association with Ukraine, and many people who made their career in the eastern part of Ukraine went on to become very important people in the all Soviet leadership in Moscow. So it's a crucial area for historical reasons. It's a problematic area. It has produced some of the key leadership of the entire Soviet Union, and in that respect, it resembles what many empires have had in the form of frontier area. So you had the Roman frontier area, you had the Chinese frontier area, and these frontiers were always the place where people lived who understood life inside the empire and life outside the empire. And because they had that broader view, they were often superior to the people who were completely at home in either one. And I think that also Ukraine actually means, I'm not a linguist, but I've been told Ukraine means borderland. So it was the borderland, at least in the east, of the Russian Empire, just as it was a borderland of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the west.
Yes.
There, another part of a prehistory comes into play, and that is that NATO, in breach of all the assurances that were given in 1989, NATO advanced until inside former Soviet Union with the Baltic states, but also in 2008 at the summit in Bucharest, Ukraine and Georgia were promised membership of NATO. And that was in 2008. And 1 year before, that is 2007, Putin gave a speech at the annual security conference in Moscow, where he explained that Russia would no longer tolerate NATO advance into the former Soviet territory, for the simple reason that no state can accept that its security would be jeopardized in that way. And well, history has shown ever since. I mean, in 2008, France and Germany, even my own little Holland, were still against that plan, so they vetoed it. Germany and France vetoed the idea of allowing Georgia and Ukraine to become NATO members. But in the period since, it has become more and more clear that this NATO membership is no longer illusory in the longer run. And there, the most important date is 2014. I already mentioned when talking about Wesley Clark. In 2014, you had the demonstrations in Maidan, which were against the elected president, but also highly corrupt oligarch in his own right by then, Yanukovych. He had been pressured to sign an association agreement with the European Union, but at the last minute withdrew because the economic consequences of that would have been devastating for Ukraine, but also would have entirely cut off Ukraine from Russia, which was at that time still its most important trading partner. certainly in terms of quality goods, and not just as a supplier of agricultural goods. And the people who came to power and were brought to power in 2014 were Ukrainian nationalists. That means the people who embodied that history of anti-Polish, anti-Jewish, anti-Russian. And their initial measures against Russian language, for instance, which is universal in the whole of Ukraine as an intellectual language, as a language of internet, of TV, and so on, set off protest movements and separatist movements. Crimea had been a problem for Ukraine ever since Ukraine became an independent state. From the start, Crimea was granted, after long haggling, the status of a separate republic. From 1991, Crimea didn't want to be part of Ukraine because it was inhabited by actual Russians, not just by Ukrainians with a Russian background, but by actual Russians. They didn't want to be part, so they were granted the status of a republic within Ukraine, special area, something like that. The annex story is something else, and that is that in 2014, these people felt very much threatened by the nationalist wave spreading from Kiev after the coup. Russia, of course, had its own interest in wanting to hold on to the Sebastopol area, and they didn't want to see that turned into a NATO naval base. And these forces came together in a referendum in which the people decided, you can discuss whether it was 90% or 95%, but I can assure you that if you look at the composition who actually lived there, you will understand that these people wanted to be part of Russia, and of course they were welcomed for the simple reason that Russia also would have annexed Crimea even if it hadn't had this referendum. And you had the uprising in the in the two areas, Luhansk and Donetsk, which are most oriented to Russia. And there was a massacre in Odessa, because in Odessa too there was a movement, but in early May 2014 that was brutally suppressed with a massacre among demonstrators and so on.
That was by the Ukrainian government.
Well, not directly by the government, but it was organized by elements like Parubi, the leader of the fascist movement. Right. They arranged to have football hooligans begin a march, and it's a very murky situation. But anyway, from 2014 to last February, you have seen a build-up again of pressure and inside Ukraine to join the West more emphatically. So NATO membership was raised again as an issue. EU membership was raised as an issue. And what is also important to realize is that the economic misery of the average person in Ukraine as a result of the stealing of all the riches of the country by the oligarchs was so extreme that people would have fallen, you might say, for any way out of that horrible situation. So, curiously enough, at some point after the initial wave and the separations and the separatisms, the most popular example of what could be a way out for Ukraine was Belarus, which in many respects is a sort of backward nostalgia museum of Soviet times. But for people in Ukraine, apparently that was an example that might be followed. But that highlights to what extent there was desperation in this country. People were extremely poor. Things were not working at all. Although I corresponded with somebody who lived there, an Englishman.
Where in Belarus?
No, in Ukraine. And he had read my book, and on the one hand was very critical, but on the other hand also complimentary. And he told me that one of the attractions of living in Ukraine was that the state was so completely absent and such a thieves' nest that as a citizen you hardly suffered from any problems coming from the state. So there were no lockdowns, there were no masks. That's what he told me. I wouldn't have been able to make that up, but he told me that is the situation. So nothing is working here, but that has its advantages. It's a sort of anarchist, liberal, anarcho-liberals paradise. Well, I would immediately add there were also the ultra-nationalist and fascist groups who are very high-handed. They attack people. The last remaining Russian-speaking broadcasters have been closed down. Medvedchuk, which was one of the leading stratum of politicians, but pro-Russian, is in the dock now, as he has been accused of treason and so on and so forth. So it's not such a paradise. But anyway, that all that was working and developing. Zelensky, the president, who is, as you know, a man with a theater background, which in itself is not a problem. I mean, Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, he was also an actor. So what does that matter? Berlusconi of Italy was a crooner on cruise ships.
And Arnold Schwarzenegger. He wasn't president, but he was the governor of California.
Okay. Yeah, of course, Schwarzenegger. Yeah, you're right. But anyway, the Zelensky was I wouldn't say stooge, but he was supported by Kolomoisky, and Kolomoisky is the worst figure among the oligarchs on the western side, because you also have oligarchs on the eastern side. Akhmetov, who has a Tatar background, but Kolomoisky is in the west, and he has 3 citizenships. He's Cypriot, Ukrainian, and Israeli, because he is of Jewish extraction, like Zelensky. And Kolomoisky is the one who threatened threatened Putin to kill him, and so on and so forth. But Zelensky was speaking about Ukraine regaining its nuclear capacity, and that set off alarm bells, of course, in Moscow, because in 1994 Ukraine, which had inherited large part of the military capacity of the former Soviet Union, gave up its nuclear arms under pressure from the United States, Britain, and Russia, who together guaranteed the integrity of Ukraine in exchange. So basically, they said, if you give up your nuclear weapons, we will take care that nothing happens to you as a society. In a way, of course, the 2014 coup d'etat, which was really a coup d'etat, classical coup d'etat, on the backs of a popular movement, which was authentic and democratic, the coup d'etat basically also scuttled that 1994 agreement, I would say. Yeah, and all these things came together, and I would argue that, first of all, you have to say, not just as a ritual statement, but that every war is deplorable and horrible. Well, you have your program is dealing with that, so I don't have to tell you. But in this case too, we shouldn't think that it's a sort of sporting match in which there are the goodies against the baddies. Once the tank starts to roll and planes start to fly, human misery
Yeah.
will be the determining factor. And also, what is important here is that all wars have always been started with the promise that it would be a short and fairly clean campaign.
Mm.
What is happening now in Ukraine is exactly the same. The Russians would come in to eliminate the Nazi element, which is very real and also has penetrated the upper echelons of the Ukrainian politics and army. But of course, they became bogged down after some time. They began to lose, to see casualties, to lose all kind of quality equipment that they thought was invulnerable. The West has been pumping in weapons since 2015. The West, I was just reading it, has armed the regime in Kiev to the tune of $5.4 billion. And we may assume that at least half of that has been embezzled by the oligarchs who have embezzled every cent that came in. But a lot, of course, has come in the form of hardware. And that's now being used, and the arms deliveries are continuing. Even Holland has just sent 200 Stinger missiles, which are missiles shoulder fire with which you can bring down a helicopter or a landing plane. It's not so high, but imagine if a Stinger from Holland would shoot down a Russian helicopter with 20 men or so on board. What situation will we find ourselves in? That's a very frightening situation. But as things stand now, Russia, of course, will always win, between quotation marks. But it will come at an enormous cost, and they will be stuck with an area of which, as before, one half is vehemently anti-Russian. Plus the fact that Ukraine has now existed for 30 years as an independent state. So an entire generation has grown up, which is used to the idea that this particular land is theirs. And that explains, I think, the unexpected resistance to the Russian invasion. That you can't reduce it entirely to the Nazi fanatics who are really fighting with swastikas and the Azov battalion, the battalion that has been financed by Kolomoisky, this oligarch in Dnipro 1 and 2, are they called. But there's also an authentic unwillingness to pass under the influence of what for this new generation, and all the soldiers, of course, will be young men, what for them is their homeland, especially if they come from the West.
Okay, so was this a strategic blunder by Putin, or was he lured into it by the West?
That's of course an argument that you hear from many quarters, that it was a provocation. I'm even willing to consider that after 2 years of COVID state of emergency, which was clearly running out of steam, something else had to come up, and it might be that forces in the West made a sort of calculated gamble that it wouldn't be bad if the war that they saw coming anyway, because WikiLeaks, the Assange outfit, many years ago already showed the documents in which the US ambassadors in Moscow warned that it would come to a hot war if Ukraine was pushed further on the road towards integration with the West. Mind you, that in the same year that at Bucharest, the United States made the offer to Ukraine and Georgia to become members of NATO, the imbecile who was then leading Georgia, Saakashvili, led his country into a war to try and recapture another separatist area in Georgia, in this case, South Ossetia. And that, of course, his country is much smaller, his army is much smaller, so he was buggered to a much greater degree than Ukraine is now. Ukraine is larger than France. Georgia is a very small, mountainous country, so yeah, by pure chance, I was in April. I don't know whether it's worthwhile telling you, but in
No,
April I
please do.
was
Please do.
in Georgia for a conference organized by a Turkish university about NATO integration of Georgia. So that was 1 month before they were invited in Bucharest. So March 2008. And it was organized by Turkish university, and the foreign students at this university had demanded that there would be at least one critic of NATO at that conference. Otherwise, it would be too dull and would be a propaganda uh, event. And that one critic was me. but but it was a very, because I had written a book on the Atlantic ruling class and so on, and but for me it was an extremely instructive event, because even in the plane on the way to Tbilisi, I was surrounded by Israeli soldiers in civilian clothes, and I recognized the Hebrew immediately. They were all very rowdy and joking with each other and so on, pestering one of their own. And later, of course, I learned that Israel had been instrumental in encouraging Saakashvili to attack South Ossetia, and on a par with the United States. Cheney was also instrumental in encouraging Saakashvili. So he was beaten in a very decisive way. The minister of war in Ukraine, who had a double passport, so he was Kezarashvili. He was Jewish and Israeli and Georgian. All these people were basically they were defeated, and the reason why Israel was involved had to do with the fact that there were bases in the south of Georgia which Israel wanted to use in case of a war with Iran. And the Russian counterattack, which followed that brazen adventure of Saakashvili, included the destruction of huge numbers of drones that were on these bases that Israel had envisaged to use in the war with Iran. But anyway, the important point is this. In 2007, Putin said we won't accept further pressure towards our borders by NATO, in breach of all the promises and agreements and so on. In 2008, there was a hot war between Russia and Georgia, when Georgia tried to recapture a lost province, of which they had three. There were three provinces that had broken away. And what we're now seeing is the repeat performance of that same principle. So there are lost provinces. The state, which feels amputated because it lost these provinces, wants to recapture them by force, is encouraged in that plan by the West, so by the United States, mainly by Britain, and the EU plays the role it's always played since the death of Charles de Gaulle, which is the role of headless vassals, who have no plan of their own. They're just sitting there and being economically active, but politically totally useless. But now we are playing for much higher stakes than at the time in the war with Georgia, because this is a real test of wills and test of strengths, and the West is pumping arms, as I said, into Ukraine, and I think the strategic goal there is to leave Ukraine as ungovernable area riddled with, you know, the measures they've taken, the Ukrainian leadership and the people in power in Kiev. They have released prisoners from the prisons and armed them with Kalashnikovs. Imagine, before you land in a prison in that part of the world, you really have to have done a few things to release those people, give them heavy arms, and say, now you have to go and fight the Russians. It's quite a step. And it will not be easy to remedy that. On the other hand, they have asked for the formation of an international legion, sort of, into which American and Canadian mercenaries and so on can also join. And
So, sorry,
and
sorry, Case.
they
Yep.
have,
Sorry,
they have
go on.
imported jihadists from Idlib province in Syria. So yeah, there are already pictures. So there you see that this is not a consistent strategy. Because what will they do with these jihadists if they don't leave again after whatever happens?
It sounds, sorry, Case. It sounds to
yeah,
me like what you're saying. Can I just want to make sure I'm following you. It sounds to me like what you're saying is that the United States government and NATO want to push Putin into a corner. Putin didn't really have too many options, so he was always going to respond the way he did, and Ukraine is sort of that Trojan horse.
yeah, that's right. But I know that probably you and I think on this on identical lines, but we shouldn't be talking about Putin all the time as if he's in a position to decide these matters entirely on his own. The sort of leader that he is what you call a Bonapartist leader, and then Bonapartist always means the second Bonaparte, you know, about whom Karl Marx wrote, history repeats itself, the first time as tragedy and the second time as farce. And it's the farcical figure of the younger Napoleon, who came to power with a coup in 1852 in France, and who became Emperor Napoleon III, and he was actually a nephew of the first Napoleon, who was a Bonapartist leader in the sense that a figure like that rules on account of his ability to balance very different powerful forces inside his own country. And from the outside, it looks as if such a politician is an all-powerful dictator. But in fact, he's just performing a balancing act. So Putin has to deal with the oligarchs who are plundering Russia just as much as the Ukrainian oligarchs are plundering their country, except that in Russia, the oligarchs have to take into account that there is a state, still a powerful state apparatus. He also has to take into account the army. He has to take into account the bureaucracy. Of course, the modern population in the big cities, the somewhat more backward population in the countryside, and so on and so forth. And all these forces balance each other, and there's one little man in the middle with his immediate advisors who are walking this tightrope. And so in that sense, when we say Putin wants this and Putin does that, of course he takes the ultimate decisions with his inner circle, but I wouldn't rule out that, for instance, the military in the present situation have played an enormously important role, because they have seen that in Romania and in Poland, installations, so-called anti-missile installations, have been installed by the Americans, which can also be equipped with attack missiles. Now, these attack missiles would reach Moscow in a few minutes, where they launched in a surprise attack. Now, that's not likely, but we all know the film Dr. Strangelove, in which
Peter Sellers.
Yeah, exactly, in which a mad base commander, General Jack Ripper, decides on his own to send his bombers into the then Soviet Union, and there's a lot of radicalization going on in the American and British armed forces. Protestant fundamentalists who think that that God will pick you up amidst the exploding nuclear devices and so on and so forth. And a general Jack Ripper might just pop up here and there. So it's very important to see whether the political authorities remain in control of their troops. On the other hand, of course, in Russia, there are also military people who are upset about the imbalance and the humiliation. Putin, in many ways, is the representative of the security establishment, and they feel that they're on the defensive and that they are being humiliated. And after the war with Georgia in 2008, in which the many problems came to light. You know, the Russian army performed very badly. Of course, in the end, they crushed Georgia, if only by just sitting on it. But militarily speaking, they were very bad. So since then, all kind of reforms have taken place. Russia has also, in response to the aggressive Western attitude, developed new types of nuclear weapons like super gliders, which fly at enormous speed and can break through any missile defense and so on and so forth. Neither you or I can be happy with that sort of arms race developments, because more things can go wrong as a result if they fly. But it is rational from a military viewpoint that the Russian military say we cannot accept potential attack missiles on that distance from the heart of our society.
So, Case, I have to ask you. You said earlier that in a war there are no goodies and baddies, but I'm sorry, I can't stop myself but thinking that NATO really are the baddies.
Yeah, but here I have the same feeling. The reason I'm stressing there are no goodies and baddies is because I don't want to allow myself to sympathize with a military machine which is creating havoc in its own right, even though morally speaking they occupy the high ground now. I mean, they have what they do is not literal self-defense.
Who's got the high ground?
The Russians. Russia is in a self-defense mode. Of course, somebody can object. Yeah, but if you attack a foreign country in self-defense mode, it's no longer self-defense. But in this case, it's more complicated. It's not like the United States and Britain attacking Iraq out of self-defense, because of the claim of Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. This is their neighbor. It's a related people. It's a split society, and so on and so forth. And they feel that, and of course they know much more about what's going on inside Ukraine than anyone outside of Russia, for the simple reason that even if the CIA had 2,000 agents in Ukraine, they still wouldn't know what the Russians know because of language affinity, cultural affinity, long-standing links, and so on and so forth. So they will have seen signals of things going definitely wrong, like when Zelensky says we want to get our own nuclear weapons again. They will know whether that is bluff or whether things are really going on that requires them to act. So in that sense, I feel that the Russians have the better moral position and are doing something which is legitimate in the light of world history. It is a matter of world history because this event, as many people have observed already, ends the era in which only the United States and its hangers-on have the initiative in world politics. Russia has now done something which shows that nobody in Europe, and also if they are remain in their right mind, nobody in the United States will even think of responding to with military means, because that would be the end of humanity. Because in a nuclear stalemate that we now have, the losing party will always, as a last resort, use its nuclear force. And of course we can only hope that it won't come so far, and that the war ends very quickly. Even then the problems will only begin, in my view, because what do you do if you have the eastern half of Ukraine, you have destroyed its army, but all these elements, radical elements, will only have become more radicalized, and so on. But that's a different story.
So what is the exit strategy here?
Well, I think the West has, as I said already, the West has a purely destructive strategy in that they want to repeat what they already did in Syria, and that is that you simply don't allow a central state to restore its authority over the entire territory. So in Syria, you have the Assad again in power, or still in power in Damascus, but Idlib in the northwest is basically under Turkish control. The Americans control the oil fields, and Israel, since 1967, controls the Golan Heights, and these days is even bombing Damascus every other day. Now, under such circumstances, no state can ever recover. But that's not just a problem for Syria, it's also a problem for Iran and Russia, which support Assad. And you may recall that at many stages, or several stages in the Syria adventure, there were people in Washington who said, what we must do is kill Russians in Syria, so that the pressure inside Russia on the leadership to stop this war, to get out, and so on. Now, such a strategy, in my view, is now also attempted in Ukraine, because Ukraine, rump Ukraine, however you want to call it, will lose the war. Militarily, there's no chance that it can do anything else but cause damage to the Russian invasion force. But Russia is much stronger and it's better organized and so on. But what the West can do is to raise the price for Russia of this victory. And that is pumping more weapons into Ukraine, having these jihadists there, having the prisoners at large, also armed to the teeth, and so on. So basically you're creating an enormous problem for Russia, because they can't just turn around and walk away. This, if you have been talking about a broader fraternal people and so on, then of course you have to take the responsibility to restore some workable society. I have no idea. I follow every day, but we're now in what they call the fog of war. That means no party in that war will even tell you which cities they conquered, for the simple or villager or whatever, or strong points, for the simple reason that you're giving away potentially important information to the other side. So it's simply, you can't see what's exactly going on, except that very slowly the Russians are strangling the armed forces of Ukraine.
But what, I mean, I asked you about the exit strategy. What do you think is the Russia's exit strategy here?
I can't make sense of that, because it's an act of desperation. You know, if Putin, you might, for rhetorical reasons, you might say, Putin, ever since he became president, has asked the West, initially even proposing that Russia become a member of NATO, he has been asking the West to take into account the interests of the security interests of Russia. That has become more acrimonious over the decades. But for 21 years, he has been saying we don't want further advance of NATO to our borders. Now that's just what's happening now.
Why does the
So
West?
if you say what's the
Okay.
exit strategy, there is no. I can't think of one. The exit strategy is basically that he's now at war, and countries like Poland are also in a very warlike mood, or at least the people who are in power in Warsaw.
Why does the West hate Russia so much?
Well, because and this is the same story that I also had in my book on the COVID state of emergency. It's not easy to grasp and to understand, but we are living in the final crisis, and I'm not saying that it's a matter of weeks but it can be a whole lifetime. But we're living through the final crisis of one particular world order and the economic system that supported it. And that is, we are living through the end of capitalism, the end of liberal capitalism as it originated in the Atlantic basin, in the interaction between Britain and its North American colonies, settlements. That system has risen to world dominance. In 1991, it defeated its last systemic opponent. And from 1991 to the present day, in some respects till 2008, when the financial system collapsed, and since then we have only had repair operations and this and that. The population is getting more and more restive. Everywhere. I just saw images from Buenos Aires in Argentina, where enormous crowds were throwing stones, and because the cost of living has become insupportable for most people. In my view, the COVID operation was a response to that. They have been thinking and planning for 10 years, initially, of course, in a very disconnected and disjointed way. And now they've played another card. Yeah, when I say they, it suggests as if there's a central direction calling up this or that office and saying, now we go for this and now we go. That's not how it works. They're objective. One of the, just in the first month or so, the COVID crisis, we had a very strong opposition group, and I was in a panel discussion. And at that point, to my own surprise, I said, what's we now experiencing with the COVID crisis can easily turn into a war, because at the time there were people who were saying this looks like a preparation for war, a curfew, people are forbidden to come out in the street, rationing, you name it. All these things were present here and there in to different degrees. And now we there's an objective dynamic at work. There, you don't have to have central direction in this sense. So once you start employing coercion as a method of rule, before you know it, a spark will fly, and you are turning that coercion into an external, in this case, a war, or at least you take steps that provoke a war on the part of an opponent who already was thinking in that direction, at least preparing for the eventuality of a war. And it all goes back to the fact that from 2008, the system is in a state of perennial crisis. why you said why do they hate Russia and China, and you might add Iran. Well, because these are the areas which still have not fully succumbed to Western rule, and have not, in the way that Yeltsin he was the exponent of the pro-Western forces. These pro-Western forces, by the way, are still very powerfully represented in Russia, except that in the current situation, of course, they will be lying low. But Putin is a hate figure. There's no. It's not necessary for you or me to discuss the man's character and so on and so forth. He's a hate figure for the simple reason that he symbolizes the unwillingness of a large part of Russian society to submit to Western preferences and to Western global governance. And the reason, for one, is that they will feel the consequences of a system that is disintegrating. The capitalist system is disintegrating. The West, as the decisive military factor, is losing its clout. And
the empire is falling.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, the other forces are not very. They're not much more attractive. I mean, I don't. You and I don't want to live in China either. Russia is a bit of a midway situation. Anyway.
Last night, as I was in the middle of asking you a question, the power cut, and the question I was asking is Putin a globalist, and by extension, is he part of the New World Order mindset?
Well, one of the, there's a whole crop of current leaders who have passed through the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders lectures or training or whatever they had. And Klaus Schwab, the famous German accent toting head of the World Economic Forum, he boasted at some point who had been his alumni. And one of the people that he mentioned, besides Trudeau and Macron, was Putin. But that is only a reminder of the fact that a ruler or somebody who heads the government is an exponent of a particular society, and that society is the real basis of his power, not the courses that he took in Geneva with the World Economic Forum. And in that sense, you can say two things: that Putin initially was very much in favor of Russia joining the movement. Russia was a late arrival to capitalism initially at its most rapacious form, expropriating everything, extreme enrichment on the one hand, extreme impoverishment on the other, and so on. But Putin's role was to end the wild years of the Yeltsin era in which this all happened, and to create a sort of normalized capitalist society in Russia. And that also entailed rapprochement with the West. And he even offered at some point, I may have mentioned that already, Russian membership of NATO. Of course, that was all waved away, and he was ignored, and so on. After 2007, when he warned at the annual Munich Security Conference, when he warned that Russia would not tolerate further advance of NATO to the east, his love affair with the West clearly was over, because now he had to represent the survival values of Russia. Russia which has been a victim several times of aggressors coming from Western Europe. And the West at large, and so we are back in the old situation. Russia has been forced to arm itself, to rearm with modern nuclear weapons, unfortunately. And it has now struck back against what seemed like plans to take by Ukraine to take possession again of the Donbas republics and probably even of Crimea. And that doesn't mean at the same time, because I have to stick to your question, which was, is he a globalist? Yes, he is. He still thinks that, at least that's how I reconstruct it. He still thinks that capitalists are superior to a planning bureaucracy, in that, for instance, the building the bridge from the Russian mainland to Crimea was done by one of his oligarch friends, and it was built to top standards, and so on and so forth. I would personally disagree that you need an oligarch to build a bridge, but that's a different story. He somehow has had to accept, and again, I regret having to talk about he all the time, as if there's one man who, even Xi Jinping, who had himself appointed in China as a president for life, is not all powerful. Every ruler is faced with the ruling stratum and the whole ruling class, in which are all kind of forces that will not take no for an answer. And it's the same in Russia. But the situation that prevails in Russia is that there's a capitalist class of extremely rich oligarchs. Of course, below that you have a layer of technical and financial and political specialists who work for them, and then you have the rest of society. And inherent in that situation is that a conflict and a class struggle will be operational in these relations. The people will not endlessly tolerate that a rich class of yacht owners who are sailing the world's oceans at their expense, because basically there's only one source of their wealth, and that is what's in all the riches of the Soviet Union have been divided among these oligarchs, and the riches of the country are currently still being sold by these rich people. That is not something that can endlessly go on unless you allow your population at large to really profit from, in a sort of social imperialist sense. You allow your people to profit from the benefits that as a world power you have in operating the world, in playing on the world market, and so on. So in that sense, the days of the current system are numbered, also because the ruling class in Russia is divided. You have an Atlantic fraction controlling, for instance, the central bank. You have these oligarchs, several of whom are integrated with the ruling class of the West. For instance, Hermann Gref, the boss of Sberbank, the largest bank of Russia, if I'm not mistaken, he is a member of the Trilateral Commission. And these are the Trilateral Commission, like Bilderberg, these are bodies in which behind closed doors, there's all kind of conversation. How should we move ahead? What are the main challenges ahead? Where the global ruling class, or the transnational ruling class, tries to achieve some measure of consensus, and where they discuss with politicians and with other people who work for them the way forward. That whole system is bound to run aground, because the engine of the capitalist system is no longer, it's sputtering, it's no longer running smoothly. And now with fast rising prices and shortages of food, of fuel, these are essential goods for the world population, and we have 7.5 billion people now, going forward to 8. That will lead to tremendous unrest, because the weakest countries, like your own continent, but then of course not South Africa, but Black Africa, north of it will suffer. The Middle East will suffer. The population, of course, not the sheikhs. And all that looks very grim. And one of the things that we have to realize with the outbreak of full-scale war in Ukraine, of course, there was a war already for many years in which the separatist provinces, and what remained of them, was being shelled by the forces of Ukraine, encouraged by NATO and the United States. And that already cost something like 14,000 people dead, also women and children, etc. What's happening now to Ukraine is still, incomparably less. Although, again, every other sentence we should say that we deplore what's happening there. No one likes war, and it's always the weakest people who suffer most. And usually they have had no role in there was no war fever in Ukraine, just as there was no war fever in Russia, except here and there in the media. Same for Ukraine. So most of the two peoples have simply been taken hostage by the forces that were looking for a violent solution, and that solution is still in full swing. Everybody hopes that it will soon end in some form of agreement. The issue of the agreement is completely clear. Recognition that Ukraine will not be a NATO member, recognition of the separation of the Donbas provinces, maybe more, and recognition of Russia's sovereignty over Crimea. I mean, that's the peace plan. So you and I can work it out in 5 minutes, and so can the leaders of Russia and Ukraine, except that behind the leaders of Ukraine, so behind Zelensky and his government, is the West. And the West wants this war to serve as a means to bleed Russia, to make it weaker, to undermine its existence as an entity that can resist Western influence.
What would happen if Ukraine joined NATO?
Well, then the war that's already going on now will remain a war, and it will rapidly spread. I don't know whether we already discussed the issue of Poland volunteering to send its old MiG-29. Well, they're not that old, but it's MiG-29 jet fighter fleet to Ukraine, and that they propose to do that via Ramstein Air Base in Germany, which is the headquarters of the US and NATO Air Force in Europe.
Sure.
Now, Russia has said that whoever delivers planes to Ukraine will be in direct conflict with Russia. And if Poland would send these jets to an airfield in Ukraine, the Russians would bomb that airfield along with the planes. But the perverse, so the question arises: will they also bomb Ramstein air base in Germany if that happens? Now, of course, that's practically inconceivable. Yeah. But it gives you a sense that the opportunities for escalation are there. Now, the United States, and there I'm speaking of the State Department, so not the defense establishment, not the Pentagon, but the State Department has said that if Poland gives its jet fighters to Ukraine, they will be replaced by F-16 US jet fighters, and no sooner had they said that, or a whole line of East European countries which have fleets of older Soviet jet fighters have also volunteered, not so much because they want to help Ukraine or whatever, but because they want to get these new jets for free, and that's yeah. these are orders of transactions of let's say $500 million US. So the governments say, wow, we like
It's
the
so
but
corrupt.
anyway, the arrangement will come to naught because the Pentagon has already said that's very risky, and we don't have so many posts in our budget to finance this sort of delivery.
Do the US government and NATO want Putin removed? And in fact, do they want Russia subdued?
Oh yes, and that dates from. There are many reports of the Rand Corporation, for instance. You know, the California think tank, originally set up by the aerospace industry in the U.S. after the Second World War, but also in the book by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 1997, The Grand Chessboard, in which he outlines that Russia should be Russia proper after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Russia proper should be divided into 3 states: European Russia, a mid-Siberian, and an Far Eastern state. And they are well aware of that. And in several of these reports, I quoted them in a chapter in. I edited a volume which was called last year, which was called "The Militarization of the European Union," and I had a few chapters in that myself. And one of the chapters is about who will protect the Baltic Energy Highway. That's very topical because one of the victims of the whole tension now is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. So we will be short of gas very soon now. But in that chapter, I also quote several instances of US reports of the Rand Corporation and others in which is openly debated how the figure of Putin can be removed, because they think that this one man embodies the resistance of Russia to subordination to the West. Of course, that's not the case. If Putin drops out, another person will come in who will be an exponent of the same set of social forces that produced Putin. Personally, I would say that I'd rather settle for Putin for the simple reason that, in my view, he's the only leader maybe in the world even, although Imran Khan of Pakistan, in my view, is also a very serious statesman. But Putin is one of a rare class of true statesmen who understands the realities of power, who has the wisdom to settle very volatile situations in a bit in the way. Not so long ago, I read a book about a very thick volume on Bismarck, the late 19th century Iron Chancellor of Germany. And there are many.
You've made the comparison before. I'd like to hear.
Okay, did I? Okay, then I don't have to repeat it here.
No. You made it on another interview. I'd like for you to repeat.
Well, Bismarck. In that book on Bismarck, you read that not only was he somebody who had a clear sense of where the long-term interests of Germany were, he was also a state builder in the sense that he expanded the realm of Prussia proper to an integrated Germany. He had a predilection that this could best be done from above rather than through democratic mobilization. And the inevitable consequence of that was that the military solutions played a large role. And on the side, he arranged for his own pension through the Bleicherode investment bank, who took care of his personal finances, because of course he had no time for that sort of trifle. And of course, with this apology that of course there's no literal similarity between two men in such different circumstances, but I think it's a nice template to begin reconstructing the motives and opportunities and habits of a man like Putin. But the basic thing is that this is, if you have ever seen anything of the interviews that Oliver Stone made with Putin, and part of which is also included in his excellent documentary Ukraine on Fire, very topical these days. So it has been removed from YouTube the other day.
Yeah, it's been censored.
But you have to watch it, because if there's anything that gives you a bird's eye view of what's of the background of what's happening now, it's that documentary. But in this film, you hear a realist speaking, somebody who has no illusions about the world, who at the same time argues not in ideological terms, but in terms of clear-headed thinking, and I find that reassuring, because whom do we have in the United States now? We have a president who, unfortunately for him, and it's a human tragedy, of course, but he's losing the sense of what's going on in the world. He even warned against. He said that the next danger was Putin invading Russia. Yeah, of course we can laugh about it, but that happens to some old people if you drink too much and do other things wrong. No, but I mean that's the main opponent. So that's again a reminder that a leader at the top is usually only a mascot. Of a whole set of interests. And it's also in the US, it's reassuring that the Pentagon and the State Department don't see eye to each other. They are really on different wavelengths. And ultimately, it's the same with Putin, as I said now several times, but I like the idea of a leader who thinks for himself, just as John F. Kennedy was in the 1960s. Or Roosevelt in World War II. These were leaders who, of course, represented whole blocks of interest that they all had to satisfy one way or another, and yet were able to synthesize this into a powerful position that led somewhere. And in that sense, we better keep Putin for a while, and I understand he has arranged to remain president until 2036. So when you are old already and I'll be gone, he's still around.
How important is BRICS?
Well, there are several interesting. I mean, that the label BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa joined later. Was invented by a Goldman Sachs investment banker, simply to indicate here you have initially four large economies who have all switched to capitalism, who have tremendous growth potential. So why don't you put your money there? On the other hand, the BRICS countries themselves objectively coalesced into a sort of loose coalition. You also have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and you have the Eurasian Union. So and you have a South Asian bloc as well. But the BRICS very, very slowly coalesced when they began to realize that investment finance, so that you invest in new harbors, in power generation, and the very expensive structures that you need to accelerate industrialization and economic development processes, that these could not be financed through volatile, speculative money flows of the type that were dominant in the West. So they needed a different form of financing. And after 2008, that requirement became acute. And it's very interesting to see that in 2014, when the coup happened in Kiev, and when later in the year MH17 was brought down over eastern Ukraine, there was a conference in Fortaleza in Brazil, in which the leaders of the BRICS decided to accelerate the process of establishing an alternative to the World Bank and IMF combination. And that was the so-called New Development Bank. And that was a very memorable occasion in Fortaleza, because at the same time, the final round of the World Football Championship was going on, and Germany, of course, is always in the last round. And Chancellor Merkel was also in Brazil to watch to support the national team of Germany. There's a famous photo in which you see Putin sitting next to Merkel with an interpreter in between, although they both speak their respective languages. And there, apparently, Merkel and Putin agreed to bring the Ukraine conflict to a conclusion by a gas rebate for Ukraine, a collective reconstruction program for that country, in exchange for a recognition, which is again on the table today, of Russian sovereignty over Crimea and the eastern provinces. That was on the table there. Putin then flew back to Europe. I won't bother you with all the details, but he flew back to Europe, and as he was flying back, MH17 was shot out of the sky. We still don't know by whom, although you can have suspicion, because the United States had instituted economic sanctions against Russia over the incorporation of Crimea, but Europe didn't want to go along with that. After MH17 had been shot down, the EU followed. It's a bit like now, Germany wants, or German industry wants, Nord Stream 2, the second pipeline through the Baltic Sea. Several countries of the EU indicated that they would not join a military confrontation with Russia. Now that Russia has invaded Ukraine, everybody is in line. So Nord Stream 2 is not, you can't cancel it because it's already lying on the Baltic Sea bed, but it's not being used. And all the countries that indicated they would not join a military stand against Russia have fallen silent. And in that respect, the current situation resembles in many ways what happened in, I'll just get some electricity here, resembles what happened in 2014. But you said about the BRICS, the BRICS were becoming less important after that critical moment of 2014, especially because India and China were at loggerheads. There were all kinds of tension. But even more interestingly, these days, negotiations have been taken up between China and India to settle outstanding issues between them. China is clearly siding with Russia now because they know that they will be next in a Western military confrontation policy. So although the word BRICS is not heard much these days, the Chinese project of train lines and shipping routes to the western extremities of the Eurasian landmass are in full swing, but they are not a BRICS project. They are a project of China on its own, with the former Soviet republics, with Russia, etc. But objectively, you might say that the BRICS combination is again becoming a factor, because ultimately the sort of capitalism that they represent is a capitalism aimed at long-term growth prospects with a strong industrial real economy component, whereas in the West has fallen victim entirely to the speculators. Where South Africa is, you are probably in a better position to tell me than I would try to explain, because I don't know. Of course, South Africa has a much smaller economy than the other four.
What do you see happening with all these sanctions?
Well, there are many people who have made a comparison with Japan. You know, Japan never, although the militarists were in power there in the late 1930s, and they had already occupied Manchuria in the north of China. But Japan never wanted to start a war against the United States. They did that only because they were strangled by economic sanctions. They had no oil if they would remain short of war. And that's why they attacked, although famously the admiral who was leading their navy told the ruling group, I can give you a number of military victories, but in the end we will lose. That's what he said at the outbreak of hostilities. And the reason was simple. Japan has fewer people than the United States and the colonial powers than Britain and the Netherlands, than still in the areas that they wanted to conquer. And people compare that. So they say Russia will become more dangerous because if it's really strangled the way it's being done now, etc., etc. But that if you look at the world map, which countries have actually joined these sanctions? You see, it's only North America and Europe. South America is not joining. Africa is not joining. Turkey, NATO member, is not joining. And the rest of Asia is not even considering whether this is something for them. So that means that although there will be some unpleasant consequences for Russia in the shorter run, they have a whole world of potential economic partners, plus the fact that sanctions always are a two-edged sword, that if you are withheld certain substances or services that you used to get from abroad, you're forced to organize them yourself. I mean, I know that South Africa, for instance, profited net, in net terms from the sanctions against the apartheid regime by building very strong, large companies, state companies, later, I guess, privatized. And the same has happened in Russia, that which has been for decades now under sanctions, and these sanctions have helped to produce to make Russia again pay a lot of attention to its agriculture. It's now one of the main suppliers of wheat in the world, and even of corn, and that. The reason why, there are real problems. I personally know a good friend who had a business supplying Russia with an additive used for calves, for cattle. His bank has been hit by the SWIFT sanctions, so he can't pay and he can't be paid. And now his company is bankrupt. Sure. So in that sense, there's a lot of fallout. But as a whole, on the overall result for Russia will be that they will have to find replacements, even for the like SWIFT, for the payment system. So they will have already a payment system with China, in which the balances are settled in their own currencies, and so on and so forth. So capitalism will die sooner than Russia will collapse as a result of sanctions.
So are you saying then that one of the counter effects could be very harmful to the West in terms of the
Oh
dollar,
yeah.
for
Oh
example.
yeah. And that is why, that's one thing. So the dollar, which of course has been overvalued for, well, maybe the entire post-war period, but then initially the United States still had to offer so much to the rest of the world in terms of
Yeah.
social models, functioning economy, an economy in overdrive, really. But all that has stalled and then began to decline after the 1970s. And yeah, what the United States has today is an overblown military machine. The moment raw materials and all kind of commodities are no longer settled in US dollars, countries' reserves are no longer in the form of US dollars. The US dollar will collapse to something like 30% of its current value. Now, of course, it's an enormous economy on its own, so with trade partners to the north and south, so it's all not so simple. Also, I'm not really qualified to make that sort of prediction. But what we are, what Brzezinski, whom I just quoted in from his book The Grand Chessboard, he also his last book was called Strategic Vision or something. And because he died a few years ago. And in that book, he said that if the United States loses its position as the leader of the West, so, the Pax Americana, the peace imposed by the United States on the rest of the world, will end, we shouldn't expect a Pax Sinica, a peace imposed by China on the rest of the world. He said in that book, if the United States fails to resume its leadership role, we will enter a long period of chaos. And I'm afraid that is what we are entering now. So
Is that the term multipolar?
Yeah. But multipolar has a sort of reassuring ring about it because it means that there are several organized entities which recognize the presence of each other and more or less allow them to behave as sovereign entities.
But that's quite interesting because Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum have openly stated on their website that by 2030, the United States will no longer be a global power.
Yeah, because they expect that then the entire world will have adjusted to a unipolar capitalist world in which digital, the digital means an entirely private economy, a monthly allowance for everyone who's useless but surviving, will have be put in place, and there's no need for a world power because there are no rivals anymore, no challengers, no contender states unwilling to submit to what is now still the West. So in that sense, he's right, except that his perspective will never come about because the difference that I just mentioned between a speculative, entirely individualized economy in which everyone is on their own versus a more organized, true, also oligarchic, but still investment oriented capitalism. These are structural changes that you don't change from structural givens that you don't change from one day to the next. And the population all around the world is getting restive, has been getting restive, especially after 2008, when people for the first time experienced that there was no food in the shops. I mentioned that maybe in our last conversation, about food riots here and there. After that, all records in the world have been broken in terms of strikes, anti-government protests, and so on and so forth. I think in our conversation yesterday, I already mentioned pictures that I saw from Buenos Aires. Yeah, I remember now. and that will become more frequent, and people will resist all attempts to towards transhumanism, to turn people into to turn living humans into appendices of their mobile phone. That's something that's not going to succeed.
Did you ever think that you would even be saying that? It's such a crazy idea, but we're actually
Yeah,
talking about it. It's so strange.
yeah. I've even been invited here in in Holland to by a student organization to come and speak about it. So I have to get deeper into it. But on the other hand, I'm not sure whether I mentioned that, but James Lovelock, the famous inventor who wrote this book at the age of 100,
Mm.
the Nova scene, the era of new. Basically, he also speaks about humanity associating itself in a very profound sense with artificial intelligence in such a way that we will be able to to colonize outer space and turn the entire universe into a thinking entity. Although we on Earth
Sure.
will still be the at the heart of the thinking process, but artificial intelligence will allow us to govern the planets and far away Milky Ways and so on, galaxies. Um, these are fantasies, and I'm not against that sort of fantasy. The only thing that we absolutely have to be sure of is that what is human, what makes us human, are the use of our intuitive intelligence and creativity remains in charge. Apart from that, if you have safeguarded that, there's nothing against the maximum use of artificial intelligence. I mean, if I look at my own work in all modesty, things that would have taken me years in the library, in library work and archives and so on, now you do in 2 afternoons in
Mm.
terms of gathering up-to-date material. That's why censorship is so self-defeating, because the media censorship now and the internet censorship actually cuts down one of the great achievements that we have.
Okay. I asked you this in the last conversation that we had a few weeks ago, and I'm going to ask it to you again. Kees van der Pijl, in front of you, there is a crystal ball. What do you see?
Well, now we see the fog of war. So every day I'm looking for the latest on what's happening in the battlefield, and there's mist, because in an ongoing war there's no concrete information except fake victories and etc.
Propaganda.
Oh yes, yeah. Otherwise, I find it a difficult question, because I often rely on, I only rely on what I absolutely am certain of, at least at the moment that I think I am. And to speculate on what is coming, I'm not so sure. For instance, I hope that there will be a revival of the interest in world affairs and the future of the planet and so on the part of the young. Not necessarily that they represent something very special except for being young, but normally we used to associate um, fighting spirit, fighting for a better future, with the student age group, young workers, young people in universities and schools and so on. And that has been a bit absent in the COVID crisis, where the younger generation seemed especially intimidated and even was made to feel guilty about, infecting the older, the weaklings, like myself, who are languishing in their old people's homes, etc. So the young were really played on. They were really put under pressure.
Mm.
You're killing your grandmother, and that has had a lasting effect. in absolutely horrifying ways. But at the moment, I'm seeing a resurgence. Here in Holland, we have 3 organizations now to represent, to restore some sort of hope for the young generation. And well, I also expect that will gain strength. But yeah, the problem is that what is rotten about capitalism has now been eating into education and news provision and so on to such an extent that you almost have to be a genius as a young person to begin to reconstruct what's really going on in the world and to find meaningful terms of coming to grips with it. And so, well, maybe that's a separate topic. You know, where and what went wrong with the development of scholarship, of social science, but by social science I don't mean some sort of exotic insights into society, but the general sense of society about itself. That is something which is getting lost now in the particular forms of contemporary academia and media.
Kees van der Pijl, it is always a pleasure chatting to you. God bless you. Thank you so much for joining me in the trenches.
Well, thank you so much, Germ, for having me.
My name is Germ. This is Germ Warfare, the Battle of Ideas.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please visit supportgerm.com.